Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. This video, we're going to be taking a look at the FNS 9mm handgun. I'm no stranger to FN products, the Fabrique Nationale Herstal, I think is how you say it. I use their crew serve weapons in the military. Some of their products in law enforcement had an FN version of the M4. But never really spent any time with their handguns. I didn't know anybody for a long time who ever owned one. I'd see them in gun shops, gun shows, passing curiosity, like, hey, this is kind of cool. Didn't know FN did that. And I didn't know anybody in law enforcement, any agencies or anything that carried the FN as a duty gun. So they were never really on my radar. And then I was visiting a friend of mine. He had the FNS-L, and I got to put a few rounds, well, more than a few rounds through it. And I was like, there's nothing wrong with this, at least on face value. Why isn't this a more popular gun? There must be something wrong with it. Or maybe FN just doesn't advertise it, which is, you know, partly the case because you just never see them anywhere. So I decided, I was like, let me go ahead and get one and see what I think. So I went ahead and bought the FNS, just the regular, what they consider their full size, and decided to do my standard 2,000 round review process on it. So in the review process, we're looking at function, we're looking at reliability, we're looking at accuracy, we're looking at features, and we're looking at ergonomics. A gun should be reliable and accurate first, but we also got to make sure that the controls and features function, to make life easy. And then of course ergonomics does play a part, because if something isn't comfortable or learned comfortable, then it's not something you're going to want to use. There are some guns out there that they function perfectly fine, but the ergonomics are so bad that only certain people really get used to them, or the features themselves make it inherently difficult to use those firearms. For features, the FNS is really well equipped. It is fully ambidextrous. You've got an ambidextrous magazine release. You've got an ambidextrous slide stop. They don't call it a slide release. As you can see, it's, and you'll see more, it's small, just like that on the Glock. So they're pretty much of the mindset, I would imagine, that they want you to slingshot or run the slide versus run the release. But even as a left-handed shooter, I had no problems manipulating the slide stop as a magazine release. Not an issue, or not as a magazine release, as a slide release. And then of course the model, you can get it optional with a manual safety. If you're comfortable shooting a striker fired gun without a manual safety, I strongly suggest you go ahead and just pass this feature right on up. Because the placement of it, if you have larger hands or you ride the grip really high, sometimes when you come out of the holster or just bringing one hand back on the gun, you can sweep that safety on just inadvertently, because of its placement is very close to where most people set their thumb when they shoot. So not a huge fan of that. I actually ended up liking the sights a lot. The fixed 3-dot or night sights. Now this is a 4-inch barrel, so sight radius might be an issue for some people versus what you'd get with the standard OEM sights you see from other gun companies. But these sights are kind of a U-notch, like a hybrid almost. It's not a full U, but it's also not a traditional 90 by 90. I like that a lot because it gave you a little bit of play in your sight picture, so you could fine-tune accuracy at greater and greater distances, which is something that's difficult on smaller guns with your standard OEM sights that are really fat and thick, and they don't give you a lot of room to play with for fine-tuning things. Accuracy is one of the most important features of a firearm. As far as the FNS is concerned, first thing I did when I got it was I took it out of the box and I went ahead and put it into a ransom rest so I could remove as much of the human element as I could. I fired a 5-round group just to check the OEM barrel's accuracy. Now, as you'll see in this group that I shot, the gun is very, very accurate out of the box. For a 4-inch barrel, this group was at 25 meters, and I was shooting 115 grain Remington. I consider this to be a damn good group for an OEM barrel. Now obviously that's new, that's fresh, that's clean, right out of the box. It hasn't been fired, the gun wasn't really hot. Obviously it started from ambient temperature. All those factors that tend to affect accuracy. Well, after 2,000 rounds, I went ahead and put it back in the ransom rest and fired another 5-round group. So this is after 2,000 rounds, another 5 rounds. The group is obviously, as you can see now, it started to open up. I still consider this to be an extremely accurate group in context of what the gun went through to get to this point. Now you may disagree, but we want to get it, kind of try to stay away from that group mentality of thinking that guns are going to be able to perform to the same standard regardless of conditions based on how they started versus how they're going to end. This is after 2,000 rounds have gone down that barrel, plus the gun's been introduced into foreign media and debris and things like that, which shouldn't be a huge issue because we're ultimately just talking about the barrel itself, but 2,000 rounds fired is 2,000 rounds fired. You're still getting acceptable what I consider your A-zone hits with that final group. So as far as accuracy is concerned, the FNS is one of the more accurate out-of-the-box guns I've fired in quite some time.
Starting temp is going to be 68. Problem is, I only have 6 magazines. Each magazine holds 17 rounds. So let's see here. That's 500 rounds divided by 17. That's going to be a whole lot of magazine loading. I don't think I've ever loaded magazines for time before. Safety. That's going on the do not like list. Not bad.
As far as technical specifications go, and I'll put them up on the screen now, this is FNS's full-size 9mm handgun, which I find a little curious considering the barrel length is 4 inches versus 4.5 or 5. If you had to set it next to another gun, it's roughly the same size as a Glock 19, which makes me think compact because I'm so used to that Glock 19 size being compact. Not a comparison, just saying it's smaller than other brands' full-size handguns. But there's nothing wrong with a 4-inch gun. There are some agencies out there that carry 4-inch guns as their duty weapons, which most people expect agencies carry full-size. And then, of course, I know a lot of people EDC, you know, they start at compact. I know some people that carry 17s or 34s or guns of that same length, but generally compact is kind of the range that everybody goes for comfort, but they still want to maintain the ammunition capacity. One of the immediate appreciable features of any firearm is the trigger. If it has a bad trigger, it's not something we're really going to want to use. I fired some otherwise great firearms in my life, but the trigger was just straight garbage, or it needed to be modified in some way to make it better. I want to know that a stock trigger is going to be acceptable. Poundage-wise, feel-wise, design-wise. Is the purchase going to be good? Is it going to be too thin, too thick? And of course, you get into the Goldilocks mentality a little bit when it comes to triggers, but initial apprehension when I saw this is it looked like an M&P trigger. I don't like the M&P trigger. I feel like the M&P trigger is too lost in the woods, so to speak. And I know I'm going to get a little bit of hate for that, but I just don't like that trigger. The Apex is a significant improvement on the standard M&P trigger. Apex trigger is money. But I like to know that if I buy a gun, the stock trigger is still going to be acceptable performance. If I had to carry this as a duty weapon, or if I wasn't able to modify the trigger, I want to know the trigger's going to work. So the FNS's trigger, to me, is a really good balance between weight of pull and the ability to fine-tune your shots. What I mean by that is they quote 5.5 to 7.7 pounds. I didn't put a trigger weight tester on it, so I don't know. I just know it feels very similar to the standard Glock trigger. Not a comparison, but I'm so used to that pull, and I'm so used to that radius, if you will, that profile of the Glock trigger, that the FNS trigger is very similar to what I've put the most rounds down range with as far as a handgun goes. There was a time in my life where I fired more rounds out of a 1911 than I had a Glock, and more rounds out of an HK than I had a 1911. So when I got this gun, I'm predominantly a Glock shooter. The trigger didn't copy Glock. It doesn't work necessarily the same way that a Glock trigger does, but it has the same general radius and it has the same general length of pull. There's a lot of uptake because they consider this a double action striker fired pistol, so there's a whole, and I'll show you closer up, so the trigger in action, but there's a whole lot of uptake before you actually get to your break, but the reset is very short, so after that first round the trigger is very manageable. It's wide enough that you can anybody who's got different finger placement can get their placement on the trigger, and you can run the gun really precise, really slow, and when you run the gun fast, the trigger maintains a lot of stability. There's no wobble inside the frame. Functionality. Took it to 2,000 rounds through a lot of conditions. Now obviously 2,000 rounds in and of itself can cause a firearm to malfunction. I didn't experience a single non-ammunition related malfunction during that 2,000 rounds, regardless of what I did to the gun. Now, obviously, you guys know I'm not really realistic in my reviews. I could make this thing fail very, very easily if I wanted to by just, I don't know, throwing it off a 4-story parking garage or running it over with the truck on concrete or something like that. I wanted to be realistic. The only time I get outside of realism is when I want to do a foreign media test where I'll throw it in mud, which I did. Man, nature is awesome. Even after that, the firearm continued to function. I'm not really surprised because I'm sure the designers of this weapon, it's military minded. I think it's military minded because it's got a lanyard hole. Any gun that ever goes for a military contract for some reason has to have one of those, at least in America. And other countries aren't that different. So they had reliability in mind when they designed it. It has metal magazines, which I love. I wish I could get metal mags for Glocks. Polymer on polymer, when you introduce filth into that mag well or you have it on the magazine, you don't have time to clean it off and you just kind of shove it back in there, makes it a little sticky. Metal mags, in my experience, drop free every single time. Any gun I've ever had that used metal magazines, I've never had an issue clearing the magazine from the magazine well if it was cold or if it was, muddy. Now again, we don't want to purposely shove mud into our guns if we can avoid it. If I have to get a magazine out of the mud, I dropped it or whatever, unless it's an emergency situation, I'm going to clean that thing off as well as I can and then reinsert it in the gun. If it's an emergency, it's an emergency. But during this process, not really an emergency. When I threw it in the mud, it already had a magazine in it, locked, ready to go. But during the entire review process, I was picking mags up off the deck, no matter what their condition was, putting rounds back in them, putting them right back in the gun, and going right back to shooting. The ammunition-related malfunction I had was a light strike. And I thought, okay, that could be the gun because it was right after the mud test. Even though right after the mud, it, as you saw, functioned fine. I was like, okay, maybe there's something wrong with the gun. So I put it back in the gun, clicked it again, nothing. Took that same round, put it in 2 other guns, and it failed to fire in both of those 2 other guns. So I'm going to go ahead and call that ammunition-related malfunction. Other than that, no issues. It's a 9mm, but recoil is something people want to know about, especially out of the shorter guns, 4-inch guns. This gun has a generous ledge on the frame, so if you do ride high and you want to apply downward pressure to the frame as you shoot, that's how I shoot. It's something you can do. But I'll go ahead and show you the recoil right now. Out of a 4-inch shooting 115 grain, very manageable. The majority of the ammunition I fired during the review process was 115 or 124 ball. I shot Remington and S&B. but I also ran hollow points through it. In fact, the very last magazine I put through the gun was 124 grain gold dot, because yeah, function of ball ammo is one thing, but function of hollow points after it's gone through a lot is another. So as you can, and as I'll show you now, it's still function reliably despite everything I'd put it through. Mostly subjective, but ergonomics are important. Some people don't like certain guns because of the grip angle. I think the grip angle on the FN is less severe than I've seen on some other striker-fired semi-automatic handguns, but it might not be something you're into. So you got to get your hands on one and see if it fits right. Now, I don't believe that comfort should be the #1 deciding factor in the purchase of a firearm, but it is on the menu of things that we have to pay attention to, because if something is just inherently uncomfortable and we have a choice, let's go with something else. Unless that something else is less accurate but more comfortable, something like that. The trigger guard obviously is more of a winterized style. You've got a lot of room in there, so if you're wearing gloves, not an issue. And for me, I have a damaged finger on my primary hand, so thicker trigger guards I have to undercut. Well, is this trigger guard, not gonna have to worry about it at all. I'm not gonna have to modify that in the least, which I really like. Features, I already kind of talked about it, like the slide stop, and if you want the manual safety, everything's really easy to get to. The ambidextrous magazine release is awesome instead of having to flip something around if I wanted left or right. Since I've been shooting dominant left hand the majority of my life, I still index with my index finger, even though this gun gives me the option to use my thumb. I'm just so hard-grained to do it this way that I'm not even going to bother with that. If you're a left-handed shooter and you like using the magazine release, it's actually in the right place, so that's cool. Obviously light rail, you can run a light on it. It's hard to find a gun these days in this size or larger that doesn't have one of those, so that's good. Drawbacks, of course, are the availability of accessories. I didn't find much in the way of holsters or aftermarket parts such as triggers, enlarged slide stop, sights. There are parts out there. If you want to run a suppressor, right now there's only that I was only able to find one source for a threaded barrel for this gun. But I think if it gets more popular, which I'd like to see, and I'll get into that, more parts obviously will become more available. So, final verdict. Woo! This thing is awesome! Sorry, I had to do that. Out of the box, I love this gun just as much as I love a stock Glock. Yeah, I said it. I am a Glockphile, or whatever term you want to use for it. I shoot predominantly Glock handguns. Not doing a comparison, but what I'm saying is if somebody's like, do you want a 19 or do you want an FNS? I'd be like, I don't know. It's hard for me to decide. Let me think about it. It wouldn't be an instant decision for me because I like this gun so much. Honestly, I would probably stock, and I might hurt some feelings here or whatever, I might go with this gun over a stock 19 because I'm going to get metal sights, I'm going to get metal magazines, and I'm going to get ambidextrous control features. Now, is this gun better than Glock? That's not for me to decide, that's for you to decide. But my personal opinion is, out of the box, this gun is just as good, function-wise, reliability-wise, as a 19. Now, I've only put 2005 rounds through this gun. So I can't say long-term right now that this gun is going to pan out as just as long-term reliable as a Glock. Because, you know, I shoot Glocks. But what I will say is, out of the box, I would go with this over a standard Glock 19. I don't understand why this gun isn't more popular. I really don't. It's been out there for a while, but I haven't really seen much on it besides ad copy disguised as reviews from some of the online blogs. So I wanted to put it through a real test. And there are some other people out there who have done really good, thorough reviews on this gun. So I'm not obviously the first one, and I'm probably not going to be the last. But I like to see this gun become more popular. I don't think I've ever actually seen one in a class, which is just also very strange because the price point, the MSRP on this thing, is comparable to what, or just a little less than you'd see for what you expect to pay for a Glock. And you get 3 magazines, 17 round metal magazines, ambidextrous controls, fixed metal 3-dot sights. Roughly the same size as a Glock 19. The only issue, of course, being, you know, accessibility of options, but everybody out there is folding Kydex these days, and half of those guys are doing it right, so it wouldn't be hard to get kit for this gun to carry for EDC or whatnot. Duty carry might be a little more difficult, but the options are out there. This gun is awesome. The only bad thing I have to say about it is I should have got the model that does not have the manual safety. I'm going to go ahead and dribble that off. And of course, lack of aftermarket parts such as sights, barrels, triggers, things like that. I'm Aaron Cowan with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.